All right. Welcome, everyone. I am very excited to have this opportunity to talk with wonderful, phenomenal artist, Angela Foz. I'm Dr. Lauren Cross, and excited that Angela asked me to be in conversation today with their work. So first, I just wanted to begin with a brief introduction about Angela. Angela Foz is a multidisciplinary artist focusing on art interventions and reclamation of public space. Their studio practice of focus has involved relief, printmaking, monotypes, and silkscreen for over 20 years. In May 2018, they completed a 6-week residency in Puebla, Mexico, where they spent time honing their printmaking technique, researching ancestral roots, colonization, and the stories accompanying them. Foz has achieved international recognition for their collective care hand-carved print upon being selected for Amplifier's 2020 Global Call for Art. They have exhibited nationally at the Rising Star 2018 Showcase at the Turner House, Kirk Hopper Fine Arts in Dallas, and other galleries. Collective Care was recently included in the Prints and Photographs Division online catalog at the Library of Congress to preserve this historic moment in our country. Recently, Foz was a part of the inaugural Women in Their Work exhibition curated by Vicki Meek. And also, Angela was a featured artist in the New Stories, New Futures exhibition in Fort Worth this past August. So before we start to talk about the work that Angela has in Fort Worth Community Arts Center, we wanted to start with a bit of a land acknowledgement. And instead of a more performative approach to land acknowledgement, I told Angela I want us to have a little bit of a conversation and reflection about what it means to acknowledge Indigenous land and what happened before and also where we are now. Mm-hmm. So Angela, what are your thoughts? What are you thinking?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren, for that introduction and for doing this recording or this live with us for Indigenous Peoples Day. Excited to talk to you all about just what it means today. I feel like it's a current conversation. It's something that we're continue to unpack and almost in a way returning to trying to reclaim a sense of ourself back that might have been removed because of just colonization and just the indoctrination of just like all the systems that we have to live with. And so I feel like with this land and water is a good place to heal and to start, having those conversations because the wisdom is there. I mean, it just hasn't been, sometimes it's hard to find and very inaccessible to us. So that's kind of some thoughts on that at first for our land acknowledgement.
Yeah, and I also just think about just the fact that, we're presently, I'm currently in Fort Worth. Angela, you're in Dallas, I think.
Yes.
In our COVID world, you never know where everyone is. And so we're currently living and working on what was stolen. We're on stolen land. Land that was actually indigenous and had cultures and tribes and rich cultures and language that existed before we came. So I just want to acknowledge that and honor their legacy. And I think, Angela, so much of what you're doing is to honor the legacy of what was before, and then also talking about what's happening now, like the Indigenous peoples that live here now that are like fighting for Native rights and how we can be a part of that.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that that's an important thing to acknowledge, that we're all a part of that long history, and how can we, as you said, like reclaim um and heal, find ways to heal the trauma from the trauma. And you, maybe like myself, um I think we both have a little bit of indigenous like ancestry. We both kind of are interested in ancestry. I think
Mhm.
we both have some indigenous ancestry in our background. I have no clue like where mine came from. I just, it's in my ancestry DNA. Like I was like, oh, okay. There's always like that narrative where a lot of Black people may say, we have Native American ancestry, but sometimes you never know whether or not that's true. And so, in doing my own ancestry work, discovered that at least in my family, like, oh, okay, so there that is true. And I think for me, a lot of that is like, well, how do I give honor and recognize ancestors that I don't necessarily have any connection with otherwise, but want to still honor their legacy. And so I'm always very conscientious about that, because it's something that um, is it's important, like just for humanity.
Mhm.
I think even more so, I think when you start to realize how interconnected you are to it, it becomes kind of like, okay, this is very important.
Yeah, I love how you frame that, just the present tense of our ancestry. It's still in our past, but it's definitely something like that we're, I feel this as far as genealogy, connecting to some history that I don't really have. Like with my grandparents, they were born in Texas, and their grandparents, I'm not really sure if they're, I feel like we're like on my mom's side, really Chicano, and Texas, the border probably crossed them. But I feel like there is some, just looking at my family and even just some of our like non-spoken ways. Like I don't have an affiliation to any tribe, but when I, have compared notes to friends who are indigenous, I mean, I feel like there's some overlap, and I don't know if it's Mexican or indigenous, but really maybe it's just indigenous. And
Mhm.
um, so yeah, I'm definitely looking, and this is a way that I've connected in a sense, because water can be like the image I have behind me is the Trinity River or the Arkikosa River, because and it is a portal, it is a portal in a sense of reflection. And so I know we've talked about our genealogy past and how, or just the ancestry. So it's a big part of my, like, almost like finding the background or finding the stories within the reflection of the water, almost kind of inferring them and making, that's a lot of what I did for the work for the show, is kind of infer some potential realities,
Right.
yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about your show, this at the Fort Worth Community Arts Center.
Yeah, let's do that.
So your show is called The Grammar of Animacy. And really is so much of what I see like in this work, and then some other works that we'll talk about a little later, that are connected to this work, are all about bringing animacy or personhood, or to make alive how we think about water. You know,
Mhm.
um, can you talk a little bit about like how you got here,
Yeah.
in thinking about your work in this way?
Yeah, so I started off with Decolonized Dallas in 2017, and that sort of was my introduction to the river, um, as it is, and that's a good representation, that that image with the lines. Um,
Mhm.
So I started off with this. So that started with Decolonize Dallas, and it sort of led me to the river in the sense of like recognizing that there's this resource that we really didn't utilize, and Dallas doesn't really utilize in the sense of like, say, like a place like Fort Worth or so-called Fort Worth, where there's like Panther Island, you can go tubing, kayaking. The Dallas waterways are a bit hard to navigate and a little, I mean, it has been at one point called septic. So there's also that, but I know that a part of that research, how I got there is, so when thinking about the show, because I've already was working with Decolonize Dallas and what that, realizing that like we talked about in the beginning, just that there are multiple narratives, multiple realities. There are people who came here through Mexican American immigrants, people who were brought here by force, and enslaved people who essentially built Dallas on stolen land. Jerry Hawkins' work is really instrumental in kind of continuing that conversation with that. So that's kind of where it started. And whenever, and also I have to say, Sarah Cardona of Teatro Dallas had asked me to create a feature monument. And I'm really grateful for her for suggesting to create something. So it's sort of like the work that I did with Decolonize Dallas, as Dr. Cross has put up, is the first step, acknowledging that there are people that are being displaced, starting, with the beginning in mind. This place was probably not called Dallas. The Archicosa was called, the Trinity was called the Archicosa. People have settled here and resettled, and there have been waves of gentrification, and probably starting from settler colonialism, the genocide, to like waves of gentrification. And so for the show, I started thinking about, I was reading Braiding Sweetgrass, which I highly recommend if on Indigenous Peoples Day that you check it out from your library. Is Braiding Sweetgrass is called, it's called The Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And so she's a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, and that's in so-called Minnesota. And she really describes, and the last thing to kind of summarize how I got to this river project with the Archicosa is that she describes the English language to the Potawatomi language, or compares it. And she says that it's English is a noun-based language, which we know there's either person, places, things, or it's. And that in Potawatomi, that 70% of their language are verbs, and they don't ascribe masculine or feminine to anything. And so and as a gender nonconforming person, thinking about, and just the conversation we have today with, how people want to be called, and how we just don't fit in this binary, and how inflexible it is, but that's the English language. So I recommend that book, and that's how I got the show title. I started thinking about, since we have the new name of the river, the Arkikosa, what that led me to the personhood journey of, how does she like to be defined, or how do they like to be defined? Is there a better word to describe? Basically describing their personhood, in a sense, finding my own personhood and my connection to the river, and ways that it has affected my work that I'll be making next year. And it's healed me in a lot of ways for, being comfortable with the water, and just comfortable in my connection to the water. So Grammar of Animacy was really inspired by the text from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and my own personal experience being Mexican American. People will say, I don't want to speak in Spanish, speak in English, let's speak in Spanish because tiene más sabor, which means because it has more flavor. So, and I just thought it was so great. Like, and I know Dr. Cross and I have talked about the different cross pollinizations or cross-cultural of just references from Sankofa to indigenous knowledges, and just everything in between. So that's how I got here, at least part of the way. Like the actual name of the show was inspired by that.
Yeah, and I feel like it might be helpful for some in the audience for us to unpack that a little bit about, what is indigenous ways of knowing, and like what is Sankofa, like what are those interconnections. I think that for me, as I see it, and as I look at your work, it really is recognizing that there was a past that came before us. And then also like not forgetting that past as we continue to look at our present and then to look towards the future, that it's really like more, instead of the kind of more the modern kind of Eurocentric model that is linear and like we're going forward and we're never looking back. In more indigenous ways of knowing, and with Sankofa philosophy, it's a recognition that, hey, in order for us to go forward and to have a better future, that we have to look back in order that we don't make the same, whether it's mistakes or that we acknowledge what happened in the past so that we can make different choices in the future, in our present, and etc. So it's a more mindful like way of thinking about the present and the future, that is not like, the past is the past, I'm moving on.
Right.
And it's kind of like, not bulldozing past trauma, right? Because we're often very much impacted by like what happens today. And there's a lot of trauma happening right now,
Yes.
right?
Yes, there is.
So I think that it's important for us to be more reflexive about like what's happening so that we can be more mindful, conscientious, thoughtful about what we're doing, and we can make a better future, right?
Right.
So I feel like that's the interconnections that I see, both in how I think of those ideas, but I also see you really calling for that same idea of looking at these past ways of thinking, indigenous ways of thinking, and saying, hey, this is still useful today,
Right. And I think with these and some of these it's not easy to look at the past and acknowledge your participation in the harm caused, and some of that the acts, and it's difficult to look past. And so what I try to do with my work is look through the lens of this indigenous way of knowing, of recognizing that things are animate, recognizing my own humanity within that, and that some of this work is that people make mistakes, and it's a matter what with the say for the river example, city of Dallas probably let some of these things happen and didn't really go after the people who maybe polluted the river or were dumping things in the river they weren't supposed to. And but that could be the road for us to move forward and say, well, what does it take to to repair the river? Forgetting all that that happened, but we have the technology. I mean, we can order a chicken sandwich on an app and it's delivered to your door. I'm pretty sure we could figure out how to clean the river, or if that was an importance, and then also looking at with the river, when you're looking backwards, the communities around it, were settled there various generations, but as a result of redlining or maybe affordability and proximity to the river that floods, and it was a risk to even just have a home there.
Right.
So with my work, I try to work with those realities in a way that's like a vehicle for a broader conversation. So a lot of the work that I've done, and so for me, I think as far as how those connections, I think it's just something I'm remembering and working on every day, and researching with different cultures to carve a path forward that looks backwards. So I really love that, because I was aware of Sankofa, but I think the way you've explained it, I think it really sinks in. So thank you for sharing that too, especially on this day. I mean, it's Indigenous Peoples Day, so it's everything's all
right.
The wealth of culture we have.
Yeah. And I think we were talking about, as we were prepping, we were talking about just how there's indigenous people around the world, right, in every continent. And so just that recognition like is a way that connects us all. One of my favorite books is Grandmothers Counsel the World. And it's the Council of 13 Indigenous grandmothers, and they use their grandmother wisdom, which is like, that's a whole like indigenous way of knowing as well, to think about the world's problems. So when we talk about like heal the world, like make the world a better place, those like things that we say, they are all, each of them are all looking at those issues from definitely indigenous thinking, but also like within their perspective areas of the world in which they come from. So like from Africa, to Asia, to, like touching every corner of the world, and people's like everywhere. And that thinking of the world as being that interconnected and that, connected to one another, like we can bring together all of that knowledge to like heal the world. And it's really, when I've shared their work with my students have always been like, oh my God, I never thought about that, So yeah, I would definitely recommend that book, So the World. It definitely brings in a lot of the essences of what your work is talking about. I want to touch on, go back to one of your pieces, past works that
and what
I spoke of a little bit earlier from Decolonized Dallas, and have you talk about like how the water is living, right? But also there are all kinds of animals and plants, and there's all kinds of living beings that live in the water too, that you kind of touch on in this piece. Can you speak a little bit about just your intentions in bringing those voices to the table in your work too?
Sure. Yeah. This and so yeah, part of this is there's a story with my mom. She grew up in West Dallas on the same street, and then she bought a house on that street, and that's where I grew up. So she was there in the 1940s, and so 47. So around early 50s, she was a young little girl. But she would tell me stories about how the salamanders, which is the banner on the right, would gather under the street lamps, like so many, because they live right by the creek. The Trinity River has a little branch called, I think it's like the West Fork from the Trinity by Loop 12 and 30. And yeah, and so that was a very, there were just so many of them. The same with the frogs and crayfish. And so whenever I came up in that neighborhood, I'd go explore the creek. The creek was not necessarily, it wasn't like a big creek. It was like small enough, but I did see like one crawfish one time, crayfish. And so that's the image on the left, the Texas crayfish. And I grew up hearing a lot of frogs, but certainly there was no signs of salamanders by the early 80s and 90s, whenever I was like young enough to care about exploring the creek. But that's like a generational change within 50 years of how these residents of the river are no longer a big part of the community. Looking at an animacy of environment, these members have been displaced also. And a good person today who's working on describing the river and showing the flora and the fauna is Cynthia Mulcahy. She has a really great practice around the Arkikosa. So if you're interested in furthering your knowledge today on like the flora and fauna, because it's getting pretty nice here in Texas to actually be outside, I'd recommend that. But that was some of the motivation on the piece, is showing the other people that were displaced, or the other beings that were displaced in West Dallas within the past cycle of 50 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the Arkikosa project, which I think really foregrounds so much of what you're talking about in the show at the Fort Worth Community Arts Center, and kind of connects so much that we'll probably end up talking about in a little bit. So I'm going to pull up that slide on that work. The Great Arkikosa River. So tell us how you came to, so, you kind of talked about how your own investigation and your own history, also the history of West Dallas, and thinking about the indigenous people who came before, but how did you extend that into this Arkikosa River project?
So with this project, it's been something that's kind of it's been evolving and different, and I've explored it in different mediums. And it's so this came about from of creating a future monument. And that was imagining, if we looked at this resource, the city of Dallas, if we looked at it as a place for recreation and a homeland for all kinds of beings. Like you can see a tiny little, like heron or something, little white little guy, little thing over there, little being over there. But I took this photo and created this postcard. It was a postcard that we sent as if it was a future monument. So that was a big component of that. So they went out to mailboxes like, greetings, welcome to the future. You've you're just visiting the Arkikosa. I was just there. It's beautiful. It's great. It's thriving. And so for this, I mean, once I started to spend time with the river for the show, I started collecting. I wanted to collect water from 7 different spots in all over Dallas. And I researched. In the show, you'll see there's a map of water collection spots, and also where. So it's just so many learnings with this project. Also where we actually get our drinking water, which one of the sources is the Elm Fork. Another source is like Lake Louisville, which is near Denton, and there's future spots. There's future spots like Palestine, Lake Palestine, and there's another spot. But this is something like, and thinking about the water also in relation to other localities, like California is facing a water crisis, Colorado, and we just don't think about it here in Texas because I guess we have some lakes in reserve. But at some point we will probably have to face that challenge too if we don't change our water practices. But so yeah, Dr. Cross has put up this map. And so in the show, I went to each location, and it was interesting because a lot of when the river was wild and not like, say, in the Trinity, it's very easy to get to. It's very straight line, but that's because the river was moved at least 3 times, starting in 1891 to 1920 in the present. So it was like a curvy line at its natural state. It's a curvy line. I'm gonna illustrate that. And then it turns just straight because that's the man-made part. And because we had to control the flooding, or that, that was the idea for the maintenance of that, to convert it to a straight river. But so those rivers, or that part, was really accessible and to get to the river. Other places, like I tried to go to Sand Branch, as we know, it's a Black township that doesn't have water. I think it's unincorporated, but they have a severe water drought an issue because it was polluted, contaminated, their well water, and I don't think they had ever been able to fix it. So I went to Sand Branch, and that was really hard to get to, and I couldn't get to it because it was still wild. And when I looked down the bridge, it was just like this beautiful, gorgeous river, and it's just like, I didn't know that we had such beauty in Dallas. I mean, I just don't think of like I think of Colorado over I think of Dallas having natural beauty, but we do. So that goes to my own ignorance. Yeah, of like not maybe being a city kid.
I think that's so awesome that you said that. And I feel like that's what kind of connects your Archicosa River project to Fort Worth, because I recently started kayaking, and like you said, it's like when you start to you not use the river, but when you start to interact and really have more opportunities to engage with the river, like that's when you kind of see, oh my goodness, I didn't know that. I didn't know this side of our
Hmm.
city, because it's almost like a whole nother way of engaging with the land. It's like a whole nother viewpoint. And you can see, like, where man has intervened in
Hmm.
some ways, with all of the different dams that are along the Arkikosa River, the Fort Worth version of that is. You can see that, and they tell you, don't kayak by the dams, and
Oh,
all
really?
that,
That's good to know.
just for safety
Hmm.
purpose. Um, but it definitely gives you a whole nother view, like, um, you just kind of end up just seeing that, even though it's a city, it's a thriving city. Fort Worth is like one of the fastest growing cities in Texas. I mean, I think Texas is like just booming
Hmm.
right for lots of reasons. Which we won't go into all of that. That's not the conversation of the day. Um, but so you can kind of understand like why our cities, Dallas and Fort Worth, are thriving from a city standpoint. But when you start to engage with the river, you start to understand like why our cities are thriving from a land standpoint of like, oh wow, you have this at the heart of everything.
Hmm.
And you would never really know that if you weren't on the river,
Right.
because
And
you
Fort Worth does a great job of like, it's yeah, there's so many waterways that you can get to easily. Yeah.
yeah. And oh, so when you were working on this project, as well as we'll talk a little bit about new stories, new futures and your project for that. We were talking about what's the name of that commission that I sent you?
It's like the Trinity Paddle
Yeah,
Commission or
something like that.
something.
Trinity
Trinity
Pre-
Kayak. Oh.
yeah, something like that. Trinity River, like paddle, like trail, something like that.
Hmm. Yeah.
We'll put that in the chat
Yeah.
somewhere. um and when I learned about that, and there's a whole like documentary on that you can find on about the Trinity River and how it goes all the way down to the Gulf. And we both have been researching that for different reasons. You've been researching that for your project, and I've been researching that for my own.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it's like 800 miles from here to the Gulf.
yeah. So, like, one of the things that they were saying was that um, this part of the river is the most accessible, but the further down you go, there there is no way to access it, and that's kind of what they're hoping to change, to find more
Mm.
ways to for people to be able to access it. So like think about 800 miles and there's only 20 access points.
I
There's
didn't know
only
that.
20 access points. So yeah, like we're missing out on a lot. To and then it also, not having those access points also means that we don't also have the opportunity to like take care of the river in those inaccessible areas in the same way that we do
Hmm.
these areas. So that's a lot to think about, in regards to just water health, which I love. One of the things that you did as a part of this project was the water wellness check.
Hmm.
Talk about that a little bit, and I'll share. I'll find that image.
Sure. Yeah. And there's a few angles or future projects for that, for the water wellness. But I wanted to do like an Archicosa, because, there in Texas, there's been like a lot of health, restriction, like basically a lot of rolling back of abortion access and women healthcare rights. So I was really like on time topical to reframe this wellness check as if that, being a body of water. In this case, I personified her as she needed a wellness check to see how she was doing. to maintain herself, her autonomy of how her water health is doing. So I wanted to make that connection. And a lot of the things I try to do is try to infuse some humor into it, because I think it's just probably just my nature to probably laugh at inappropriate times, which annoys some of my family members, but that's how I deal. It's an overshare, but yeah, I wanted to equate the water as a person that needed a test. And, I used a home kit to test the water, two different kits. So one for well water and one for drinking water. And, what I found was it was mostly healthy. And going back to what we're talking about with like the river, its length and some parts being accessible, some of the parts of the river act as a way to clean itself. But I know with human interference, it makes that job for the river that would be natural and easy a lot harder to do. So one of the aspects, so I recommend everyone to check out at the Fostastic, because we have an interview or like a water test, a spectacle or examination with Jody Voice Yellowfish, who's a part of, and I always have to look at my notes, so I want to make sure I get it right, MMIW, Texas Rumatriate. And she's a local Indigenous leader. And so she was on, and also Danielle Ellis from Brasswise Studio. She works with Texas Mermaid Spring Water, and she also works with Sand Branch to bring water in a kind of mutual aid style fashion of that. But yeah, I wanted to test the water in a way that people was relatable, that everyone should be able to have access to healthcare. Think about, how is your access to healthcare? To think about a woman having access to a wellness check that, so yeah, those are some of the aspects I explored in a future part of that. I have a friend who's in water conservation. She was in Milwaukee, but now she's in Portland, and we just reconnected. So I'm going to probably do a live with her and talk about some of the ways in which like the systems are created and how they purify, just learn a bit more about the water in a true wellness check. Because I did a home kit. I do not want to invalidate my science, but it is an experiment, I guess.
Yes. Well, what's so funny about that particular part of your project is when I was in I think middle school, I don't know if I ever told you this, but my dad is he's in his area is in environmental science. So
I didn't know that.
And so when I was growing up in middle school, a friend of mine did a science project called How Hard Is Your Water? And we came up with that because my dad worked in water treatment. And so, I think I must have asked, like, what's the major issue like with water today? And he was like, well, a lot of people, tend to talk about how, the water quality. And so he taught us how to do, and it was more about like testing the hardness of water. So it may have similar test to what you did.
Yeah, there was a hardness of water component, and it was very hard. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. So like when I was seeing what you're doing, I was like, oh my gosh, you took me back to that particular science project where my friend and I were both in Girl Scouts. So we traveled all across Texas. And so camping and stuff like that. And whenever we go somewhere, we collect water. And then we would test it.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, oh my gosh, you're bringing back. bringing the water back.
That's
water memories.
I'm glad that brought back that memory for you. And I think I had that memory back and for my experiences, I went to the Edison Environmental Science Academy. And so that school was built right next to the lead smelter in West Dallas. So Singleton, on Singleton and Westmoreland. And so we did lead tests on the and I think it was by Mr. Louis Sepulveda. I think he tried to run for council. He's an environmental activist, but his sons went to the school that I went to. And, I think it just really stuck with me, the fact that we were testing for lead and I was probably like 12 or 13. And then realizing later that the swimming pool I learned to swim at was condemned because of lead, because it was literally right next door to the lead smelter. So, but but it's really important as a young person to do these tests, like even just for getting a kit with your kids, and just because I mean, it brought up a water memory for you, and it was super impactful in a lot of ways, right? Immeasurable. So I think that lead test stuck with me too. And yeah, I think it led to it being declared to super fun. Not my research in the environmental science class, but
Right.
Mr. Sepulveda's, I guess, point, that this is an issue. So you never
Yeah.
know where these things can go.
Well, and I think about how, so many artists and scholars talk about, art is life, right?
Mhm.
How our memories, our experiences, often make their way into like what we end up thinking about as like our art practice. So just thinking about how that past
Mm,
experience of testing water for lead um, could spark, a sense of like, well, why not, test water
right.
and do a water wellness check as it relates to this bigger project.
Mm,
And I just always love when artists like are constantly challenging what we can talk about and what we can actually physically do in our art practices, because I think these are the ways in which art becomes more accessible to a wide range of different types of people. Because when we're ourselves
mm,
in the fullness of what that might look like, we relate to other people, and then people can see themselves in art when we allow ourselves the space to be who we are, and not you know some sort of prescribed version of what art should or could be. I think that we open up doors for art.
yes.
Is so appropriate, right? Because in indigenous ways of knowing, art is life. It's a part of, it's not separated from one's everyday, world. We're often kind of taught that like art is like over here and then
Hmm.
like there. But the inner connection and opening doors like that is so important, I feel. And that's just, I'm all about that anyway.
I know. Yeah, we were just talking about that too in the beginning, or you were just saying that art is life, or Indigenous ways are where art is a big center, the daily life of Indigenous
Yes.
living, and it is. It's if you're thinking about your own life and how you prepare your coffee, or it just calls to question in like your daily rituals, and how
Mhm.
art plays into those things, and
Yeah.
also just, yeah. So I wholeheartedly agree with that. Mhm.
Is there anything that you want viewers, and how much longer is the grammar of animacy up for our audience?
Yeah, it's up till October 30th.
Okay,
So
so
yeah,
we
end
have
of the
a little
month.
time.
Right. Yeah.
Anything else that you feel like people should know as they're coming to the gallery to see the show, or even if they don't have a chance to, if they just want to better get to know your process and what you're thinking about in your work?
Yeah, so the show will be up till the 30th. And so when you go to if you're able to attend the show, there's a couple different exhibits about, or a couple different pieces about um, water. You'll see a land autonomy decree where the Arkikosa, the future, declares her sovereignty, her personhood. The water, and the water jugs, you'll see a map that shows all the places that I went, and you can actually visit. So it's a Google Maps. You can visit these places if on Indigenous Peoples Day or anytime want to check out. And I recommend Arlington, that spot,
Mhm.
because that spot was beautiful. And then lastly, probably the Old Gold Standard, which is a really tongue-in-cheek version of what does it look like when we value water in the same way that we value gold? And what if this place is a restaurant? So thinking about my own like experience, I never really worked in a restaurant. I did have one experience as a hostess, and that didn't really go well. So I don't know, maybe it was still lingering, that thing. But yeah, I would recommend if you check out the oldgoldstandard.com. And if you're not in the area, you can check out oldgoldstandard.com and look at the where you can purchase an ounce of water for 1900, or and I've built content around this, or commercials for it on my Instagram at the Fostastic, just kind of playing on what if we had water tastings like we do with our fine like wine, or really good IPA. I like IPA a lot. Really good beer. So yeah, those are the things. And you can follow my work at angelafos.com, and I have it's an ongoing project. So the last part of it, since I asked the water first, but I collected the water. I have to release the water. So I'll plan to do that around Dia de los Muertos, which is coming up November 1st, as a part of like, how do you release something with an intention, and return the water back? Because the water, when I collected it, the final note for my show was pristine and clear, but as it's been in the gallery, because it's enclosed, it has changed consistency. So that's one thing that I learned, speaking of art, and how you put something out there, and then you create something, and then maybe it changes along. You have some learnings and a sense of testing of like how the piece evolves and performs. So I will say that the water was clear when I collected it, and I probably had to put up a note that says like, an update that says like, this is due to it being an enclosed structure, and also that's also further saying that water being contained in a way that isn't the best
in its element.
in its element. So that's one thing. But that's how you try things, you learn. And yeah, really excited for y'all to see the work, and appreciate you, Lauren, for hosting this. Always fun to talk.
Yeah. Before we go though, I do want to give you the opportunity to talk about Water Has a Memory, the piece that you did for New Stories, New Futures exhibition at Pioneer Tower, which was happening simultaneously as you opened the show in Fort Worth Community Arts Center. So before we go, I do want to give
absolutely. I want to talk about that.
to kind of make that connection between that work.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, because this work actually happened before the Grammar of Animacy, the New Stories, New Futures. And I want to say, going towards or acknowledging the fact that like having a good working partnership, I feel like with Dr. Lauren Cross, with you, like you created this space for this idea, this incubator. So the first part of the project started off with Teatro Dallas. Second part for me is this project, because this project, you gave me the space, because Lauren, Dr. Cross curated the show with 10 other phenomenal artists, and all created phenomenal projections. Highly recommend you check all of them out. They're local to Dallas, which is also super special to this. So this, once I dove in, I did so much research, spent time in the river, got in the river, and I really just listened and started thinking about, if the river could talk, what would she say? What could, what would she want me to know? And so I used those musings and the musings to show, like Toni Morrison's quote, "Water has memory," was, books and literature is always like my main inspiration of how I think about things and reframe things in my mind, my decolonization of my own learning. And so she has a great quote that all water has a memory. It's just returning back to what it remembers. I'm sorry, I should have wrote that down, but I was thinking about water in the sense of water is always moving, it's flooding, it's remembering. It is essentially us also, because we're 70% water. And I recently read this book of a Japanese artist that an associate gave me, of a Japanese artist who was studying water and studying the effects of saying loving things versus hateful things, and playing music and that sort of thing. And the stat that I read in his book was that that we're 70% water, we're 100% water, 99% we're fetuses, we're young, we are 70%. And then by the time that if we were lucky enough to age into old age, we're like 30%. So that was interesting. And so when I think about when we're remembering the water, the raindrops that fall, I wanted to create visuals that represent the fullness of that, the memories of it. And if each raindrop is falling in the water and the ripples that happen, and how that also, we have an idea and you put out that idea, it's rippling. And so just, I wanted to create, and you can see that in the show, like in its fullness or on my website, but it was a beautiful opportunity to, work with you and to just have a space, because that's important, someone, the support. A lot of this work doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's there are people doing the work, but then there's the community of people who hold space, create opportunities, and even extra hands, like my Nora Soto helped me a lot with creating photographs and creating some of the elements like land autonomy and like the staff and stuff. And, I'm just so appreciative of the people that I know, and it's just helping me in my practice. And but yeah, New Stories, New Futures is just incredible. And just seeing people walk by these large installations of images and seeing them stop and, think about the river in a different way was super beautiful. So, kudos to you for creating, for really spearheading the name and just the theme and the content as a curator. I just don't think Fort Worth will be the same. It isn't.
Well, and that was fun when we were in, particularly with your piece in the show, because remember we were thinking about the placement of your work in the
that's
show.
Right.
And we were thinking about, you were really reclaiming Arkikosa River and so like I was like, well, you need to be as close to the river as possible.
That's right. You did say that.
Like where you were located. And I think it was so powerful just to walk into the exhibition and to see your piece there. It just was so powerful and meaningful, I think, for people. And I feel like, the Trinity River, as people know it in Fort Worth, is very special to the city. So I think to bring this new way of thinking about it and renaming it Arkikosa, I think added a whole nother dimension to think we would have thought about before.
Right. And to your point about the placement of it, you had to walk around two different facets. So it almost even the thinking, the past and the present. So when I created the installation, I thought, one side was sort of like the past and the other side is more of the present reflectiveness. So that was a great placement, that you curated,
Yes. That was a lot of fun to see what you developed for that, as well as all the other artists together. I think made it a very special moment for the city. And with that, how would people who want to follow your work more, how would they get in contact with you moving forward?
Yeah, just my website is good, angelafaz.com, and I'm probably on my Instagram the most. I have a Facebook, but it's dusty. I don't usually use it. So, but it's at thefaztastic.com or at thefaztastic. But yeah, I'll be doing like a water ceremony, probably some more lives, talking to Cynthia Mulcahy about the flora and the fauna, maybe Chicana nature. She also does some like guided tours for families and just folks. So yeah, that's how you can find me. I'm on the interwebs and locally here in Dallas.
Awesome. Well, for all the people that are fans of your work and excited about the Grammar of Animacy and just the value and personhood of water that you brought to the center in your work. I'm sure we'll be following you even more so moving forward. But we appreciate you, and I'm a citizen of Fort Worth as well, so it's always nice to have your work here in the city. And I would just wish you all the best, and exciting to be able to have this conversation with you about water, which is so important, and Indigenous culture on Indigenous Peoples Day.
Yeah, it's really cool. And yeah, I want to also shout out MMIW Texas Rematriate, because they have some great ways to get connected, and a good partnership there. But yeah, I'm so grateful for you too, Lauren, and for this time to talk about water and to see what other projects we get up to. Because it's never ending with water. I think it's like an ocean.
Yeah. It's never ending, always flowing, right?
Yeah.
We could go on to all day.
I know, we really could. Probably need our own show, I think.
I think you're right on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Angela, for your time today. I hope everyone who's watching today enjoys and goes out and continues to learn and honor our Indigenous history, past, present, and looking towards the future. And that's it.
Ashe. That's it. Yes, thank you so much. And thanks to the Fort Worth Community Arts Center for hosting us. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, bye. I guess bye for now.
Bye for now.
Thank you.